The vitriol is, see, I just finished reading another book on postmodernism, an Oxford book on postmodernism, and on Derrida in particular. And like, there really was an attempt on the part of the postmodernists, and this is allied, I think, with their fundamental Marxism, to demolish the idea of the autonomous individual. So, for example, one of the things that's really interesting about the current free speech debate is that it really isn't a debate, because you have to be in the Judeo-Christian / Enlightenment tradition to believe in free speech. Because to believe in free speech, you have to believe that they're autonomous individuals who have their own viewpoints, who can spontaneously generate creative ideas, and then who can engage in an active dialogue in a manner that consists of fundamental goodwill and truth, and that you can change each other's opinions, and that you can come to a negotiated agreement. You have to believe all of that, including the autonomous individual, in that concept. The logos, which is what Derrida was what he criticized so heavily, that idea of logocentrism. You have to believe in the autonomous individual. And the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists, they don't. They believe that the individual is a mouthpiece for a power assembly, and that there's no such thing as free speech, which is why they know platform, right? It's not, well, it is, so the debate about free speech is way deeper than who should be allowed to talk. The debate about free speech is whether or not there is such a thing as free speech outside the power game that neo-colonial Europeans are playing. And so what I'm doing, and what you're doing with me, and I think what everybody in the IDW is doing to some degree, is speaking to people as if they are autonomous individuals who are the bedrock of civilization and sovereignty, and that is absolute anathema to the radical left. And so they see that as a fundamental challenge, which it is.
If you're a good person, you try to be a good person, every time you receive a piece of criticism, as a good person, your first response should be, did I do something wrong? Was it me, right? And as somebody who's trying to get better at being a human, and also just at what I do, I spend an awful lot of time trying to look at those criticisms and say, okay, is that reasonable? And usually it's something from 10 years ago. It's like, okay, yeah, I should have done that better. That was stupid. I shouldn't have said that, right?
Yeah, but it isn't always 10 years ago for you, because you even had that nice moment in this studio where you said that you have a sort of public and private position on addressing trans people by pronouns that they want.
Right, 100%.
Where you don't want to be bludgeoned into doing it, but privately, if you knew someone that was trans and respected them, of course you would use the pronoun that they want.
In the same way that I would do that with anybody about anything, generally. If I'm in a private conversation with somebody and when I want the conversation to progress beyond something that's unrelated, then I'm not going to go out of my way to offend them, because it's pointless. But in a public conversation where the express topic being discussed is human biology, then I'm not going to give into the argument that I have now given up my argument by using the pronoun of your choice, because that is undercutting my own argument. We're now in a public debate. That's a different forum. But that idea is that you are unsympathetic. And I think this goes to the fundamental conceit of folks on the left, which is that they are more sympathetic human beings, and people who oppose them politically are unsympathetic human beings. And this goes back to the individual versus communitarian distinction. For the left, if you're an individual, this means that you are inherently unsympathetic to others, because your individuality stands against the collective. If you're a member of the collective, then you can show that by the amount of sympathy that you have for other people. And so I think,
but also for the collective, which is also a very weird form of sympathy, because the collective doesn't suffer, individuals suffer.
Right.
And then the other thing that's interesting about that reflexive identification of sympathy with virtue is that it's actually extraordinarily immature, as far as I'm concerned, because most complex problems aren't solvable by reflexive sympathy. And reflexive sympathy is more like it's more like an instinct. It's more like anger, or it's more like jealousy or rage or love, for that matter. It doesn't have that cognitive component that enables you to take apart complex systems and to analyze them and determine what the problem is and what a solution might look like, and then to lay that out in a cold and calculated manner towards some positive end. It's this automatic assumption that because you're overwhelmed with pity, let's say, that somehow makes you morally virtuous. And not only does it not make you morally virtuous, it's often the case that, and this is the big Freudian observation, that all-encompassing pity actually has a devouring component, and that's that overprotectiveness that Jonathan Haidt and Lukianoff have been writing about, for example. And that interferes with the development of people's autonomy. And so the reflexive idea that because you're a sympathetic person, you're good, is bad enough, in addition to the fact that, well, all the sympathy is on the radical left, which it certainly isn't.
Well, I think that one of the things that Haidt talks about, and this is where I think the left has taken advantage in so many areas, and I say the left, and I don't mean people who are liberal. I always make this distinction. There are people who are on the left,
Thanks, man.
who are liberal.
Appreciate it.
Right, I mean, this is Dave's point all the time. If you're for free speech, but you disagree with me about tax rates, you're a liberal. If you're somebody who's on the left and you want to shut down debate because you fundamentally believe that free speech is a conceit of the power structure,
right.
Then you are on the left. But what Haidt says, and he's correct about this, is that in any conversation you have with anybody, there's sort of an entry gateway to the conversation, and that is showing that you have goodwill. So showing sympathy is one form of doing that. So what the left likes to do is prevent the conversation from happening by preventing you from appearing as a sympathetic human being, meaning that. So, for example, when I talk about transgenderism, the first thing that gets thrown at me is, you don't care about transgender people. Why are we even having this conversation? You're trying to be mean. You're trying to create violence against transgender folks. And this is why this language is constantly used. Because if we accept that I have tremendous sympathy for people who are suffering from what is, by any measure, a disorder, and if I say that we have to look at sympathy for these people and try and find the best scientific solutions and try and figure out what's best for society generally, not just for transgender folks, but for kids who we're teaching who can be easily confused about gender, or if we're looking at what's the best solution for doctors. There was an article in the New York Times like last week with a person suggesting that doctors should be forced to perform transgender surgery simply based on wants, not even based on an assessment of need. The doctor should not be able to assess whether somebody needs the transgender surgery or whether it will be...
Well, that's basically the situation in Ontario already, in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, it's on demand. It's just like any other optional surgery now. I mean, this sort of stuff has real societal consequences, and so what the left will do is they don't want to talk about the societal consequences. Instead, what they do is they say, you're not welcome in the conversation because you're unsympathetic. And so this is usually what's thrown at me. And you know, fairly enough in the sense that my slogan is facts don't care about your feelings. But what I mean by that is not that you shouldn't care about other people. It's that in the end, the solutions that are going to lead to better lives are not going to be feelings-based. They're going to be facts-based. This does not mean I have to be an unsympathetic human being. So, for example, there's a story that I really haven't told publicly because I don't like to tell these stories publicly because Maimonides has a basic principle of charity, which is the best form of charity is anonymous charity, because then you don't get credit for it. So I don't want to make it seem like this happened simply because I was trying to take credit for it. But several weeks ago, I was speaking at a university, which will remain unnamed for anonymity reasons. And this topic came up. A transgender person got up at the microphone and asked a question. And the conversation kind of went sideways. The person started talking about their personal story, and I started kind of picking holes in the personal story a little bit. And it's probably an exchange that I could have handled better. But in any case, the person got very upset and started to cry and then left. And this is all on tape. And it was one of those situations where, because I give speeches in Q&A forums and because there are a lot of videos of me destroying people, it's one of those situations where if the tape comes out, it gets 5 million views and Shapiro destroys transgender person.
Right.
And I don't want that to be what happens at my lectures. If there's going to be a Shapiro destroys video, which we don't even cut, then I would like it to be like just a rational exchange where everybody leaves feeling good about the exchange and somebody lost and somebody won. Fine. This was something different. The person got visibly emotionally upset, very upset. And the people who were running the event happened to know who this person was. So I called the person up on the phone and I said, that really didn't go how I wanted it to go. You know, I have my public position, but that doesn't mean I don't have sympathy for you. I went to the organizers of the event. I had them cut that part out of the tape because there's no reason this person should be exposed to ridicule. And then I had coffee with the person the next morning to ensure the person was doing okay emotionally. Okay, that's not coming from a place of I don't care about people. This is coming from a place of these are important, vital public conversations. And shutting down those conversations by saying that I don't care about a human being, that I don't care about what happens to people, is the nastiest form of no platforming, because it's not just saying you don't deserve a platform for your views because your views are so terrible and so awful. It's saying that your views are inherently evil. Yeah. They're inherently sociopathic.
And you are too.
And you are too. And that's something that I think is actually a form of assholery beyond comprehension.
I also don't think that you can care for people. I think that you can care for individuals. And I mean, one of the things that's been characterizing the tour that we've been doing is that, like, when I'm lecturing, I don't lecture to the audience. I lecture to individuals, and I'm not lecturing to them either. That's the wrong way, because I always include myself in the discussion. So if we're talking about ethical principles and how they might be, what would you call it, put forward or founded more solidly, then I'm always including myself in the list of perpetrators who need some improvement, right? So it's just discussing with people one at a time, even though they happen to be very large audiences. And then when I see people afterwards, because I meet about 150 people after each talk, then I get not a huge amount of time, but enough time to make personal contact with each person. And I'm very careful to do that, extremely carefully, because I'm very happy they're there. And they often tell me a story about, you know, how they were suffering in some way or things weren't set right in their life, and that they've been trying to develop a vision to aim high at something that's worth aiming at, which is part of the advantage of hierarchies, right? Which is something we should talk about, because you can't aim at something without privileging it over something else. And if you don't have anything to aim at, then you don't have any purpose in your life, and that's a bloody catastrophe. So anyways, they come up with a vision and they're trying to be more responsible. And then the individualism aspect of this is, you know, I've outlined to people that they're to take responsibility for themselves, which is not the same thing as to be individually selfish, and to do that in a way that also makes them responsible for their family, and to do that in a way that also makes them responsible for the community. So the individualism isn't the selfish individualism that the leftists are criticizing by any stretch of the imagination. It's the individual positioned in an iterated game, right, that includes them as individuals stretched across time. So there's already a collective in that, in some sense, and then them in relationship to family and the community, but stemming from the individual outward, which I think is part and parcel of the Judeo-Christian Enlightenment philosophy. Anyways, these people come and tell me this story, and they say they were in a bad place and that things have improved a lot, and they're kind of sad about the bad place part and visibly upset often, and then they tell me how things are improved, and they're really happy about that, and it's very touching and emotional, and that's where caring takes place. That's right at the level of the individual. I went into a Whole Foods yesterday, and this happens quite often, and so I was there, and two of the guys from behind the meat counter came out separately, and they said that they had been watching my lectures, and one of them talked about the fact that, you know, he has a 7-year-old son, and that he wants to do right by him, that he's been looking really hard for ethical and moral guidance, and that he's been reading and listening to my book and concentrating on the parts about telling the truth and not lying. And I'm having these conversations with people one at a time about them striving hard to develop an ethical, philosophically grounded ethical perspective, you know, and it's so interesting to see this happening and to see who's doing it.
Well, this is I think an important point, is that I get asked a lot, because I do get so much criticism and flack. I get asked a lot, have I ever been confronted in public? Because I go out in public, you know, with my family to Disneyland. We went on Thanksgiving to Disneyland, and I got, you know, accosted, not accosted, but people came up to me because they like my stuff or they enjoy it and they want to take pictures. Probably happened 35 to 40 times over the course of the day. And they asked me, has there ever been a situation where somebody came up to you and said something mean or nasty? I can't think of one. I can't think of one time this has ever happened. Now, online, that's all I get. And so the point here is that when it comes to individuals who are affected and who actually feel good or bad about you, it's a collective mob mentality that allows people to protest you and then protest me, and then that is picked up. The mob mentality is picked up by individual journalists who see themselves as sort of champions of the people broadly, but not champions of individuals, because you still can't find the individual who's been victimized by Jordan Peterson. You still can't find the individual who's been victimized by Dave Rubin or the individual who's been victimized by Ben Shapiro. You can't find those people. So instead what it becomes is, oh, it's a broader group that's victimized, but none of those people have ever come to me personally and said, you victimized me, you hurt me, because they can't name a situation in which this has happened.
Well, I always love when they say that we're radicalizing people. And it's like, if I open up my inbox, I'm getting emails from all sorts of people, usually on the right, who say that they were a little more extreme on the right, and that because they see a decent liberal who will treat them with respect, they've modified some of their opinions. But what do you think about this, just at a psychological level, the disconnect between what seems to be happening in the real world on a day-to-day basis and the way a huge amount of people are behaving online? What do you think is psychologically happening?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, it could easily be, like, if you think of venues like Twitter, let's take Twitter as an example. We don't really understand much about how people communicate, period, psychologically. One of the things that psychologists do know is that if there's any distancing between you and a person, so for example, if you're inside a car, you're much more likely to act in an impulsive and hostile manner. And that because one of the things that seems to mitigate against that impulsive hostility is whatever mechanisms kick in when you're face to face with someone. So those might be mechanisms that are associated with innate sympathy, for example. And so that regulates your behavior. And because most of the time in our evolutionary history, you were interacting
right
directly one-on-one with someone. That seemed to work out quite well.
Cavemen weren't doing it with their
No. They had to carve in insults into walls, and that took a lot of time. And so, but on Twitter, like, it could easily be. I read this little article here a while back showing what words needed to be in content for those to be most likely retweeted, and they were almost all high-level negative emotion words. And so it could be you have this huge pool of people, and then it might be that only the person who's in a bad mood and is irritated that day, or is sort of chronically like that, or dispositionally like that, let's say, and who is specifically angry about something that they saw right then, is likely to tweet. And so that gives you this tremendously skewed view of the consensus, because you assume, like, if there's 100 people that show up in a mob outside your door, you assume that there's more than 100 people mad at you, right? They're a representative of a much larger group. On Twitter, you can't tell if the 30 people who say snarky things, especially anonymously to you, you can't tell if they're representative at all. And they're likely not. And, you know, that very narrow bandwidth, that 140 or 280 characters, might also be something that really facilitates angry, impulsive responding. And so we don't understand any of this psychologically.
I mean, I think there's something else happening too, and that is that both Twitter and Facebook, all social media, is basically something different in human history in the sense that it's just a crowd without a purpose. So it's a crowd looking for a purpose, meaning that throughout human history, when you actually had to have face-to-face interactions with people, the only reason you would show up in a crowd is because the crowd had a purpose. So where were you typically doing this? Is you were going to a church, right? Everybody was there to worship. Everybody was there with a common goal in mind, right? You were a member of the army, and so there's a common goal in mind. Anytime you were getting together, it was because there was a party, so everybody was there for the party. Twitter is legitimately people waking up and just, I want to interact with other humans. There are no other humans around. And so I'm here, and you're here, and we're all here. And look, somebody just said something. There's a common purpose. Let's jump on that. And then there's this backslapping effect of the person said something, and I mean, we all use Twitter, so we all know that if you are, the most dangerous thing about Twitter, if I could do anything with Twitter, I would get rid of the mentions tab. The reason being because if you are if you are just a human, it encourages bad behavior, especially because it encourages you to be looking and seeing how people are responding to you. Because as human beings, we're constantly looking to see how people are responding to us, and so this is
which is generally a good thing.
Right, it's generally a good thing, except that it's an ego machine.
Yes,
so
well, that's the downside.
Because one of the keys to being a good person is to recognize most people aren't thinking about you 95% of the time. Right, you're not that important as a human. And so in order for you to be important, you actually have to do something important. But because Twitter functions in such a way that all you get is that feedback loop, it encourages you more and more to look for more of that feedback. It makes you feel good. I mean, you get a little endorphin rush every time there's a nice comment about you. You're fresh for more nice comments. That doesn't happen in real life. There's never a situation in real life in which that happens. And when it does, it's a major life event. It's a wedding. It's bar mitzvah, right? It's something where people are collectively celebrating you. But on Twitter, everybody is collectively celebrating everybody else. And the people who issue the strongest opinions are the people who receive both the most condemnation and the most celebration.
So in a weird way, not that we want people to go into their bubbles, but are these town squares they're almost too big to actually ever function properly? So every week there's another story where Jack says, I'm going to get rid of the likes, or I'm going to get rid of follower counts. And they're always trying to float these ideas to manipulate how we all behave with each other. But in an odd way, having everyone from everywhere on these platforms really doesn't make sense in some bizarre way. I'm not saying that we should be in separate platforms.
Well, there's no community.
Yeah, because
which is Ben's point.
Right, so it's like we need something that has community, I think, but then the danger is that we end up in our little echo chamber.
Right, I mean, the need, it's fascinating because if you look in other places in the internet, just structurally, the way that the community works is a little bit different. The way that it works, or it used to work 10 years ago when people actually visited websites directly, was that you'd have something like at National Review The Corner, and it was a bunch of people, you know, like us, sitting around and discussing ideas back and forth, like a group blog.
Yeah.
And it was restricted to the people who were discussing the ideas. And then below that...
Or a video game board or anything else.
Exactly. And then below that, you'd have the comment section, which was all about those particular conversations. Because Twitter is fragmented, there's no actual conversation taking place on Twitter. There's me saying something and you responding to it and me not responding to you mostly, and then me tweeting another thought, and then you responding to it. And the idea of having a long-form conversation, every time it happens on Twitter, at the end of the conversation, you find someone saying, this isn't the appropriate place to have a long-form conversation. If we were going to do that, we'd be on a podcast, we'd be writing each other letters. Like this isn't the way to do that. And even when I'm discussing with my peers, even when I'm talking with people on the left who I talk with on the phone, instead of having a conversation on Twitter about the topic, I will pick up the phone and call them and have the conversation, because you can't have a good conversation on Twitter. You just can't.
How much of this is connected to one of the things that you've brought up in many of the lectures, which is that we're just getting information so much faster right now? We can not only just open up our phone and have basically the world right there, but we can listen to podcasts in double speed, which if you listen to Shapiro in double speed, it's...
You go back in time, actually.
But yeah, I listen to you in half speed and it's still a little fast.
I just sound drunk, yeah.
But just the nature of the technology, how it's just speeding up our ability to take in information. Maybe we haven't evolved fast enough.
Well, it's also we're taking in kind of pseudo information, because it looks like information, but it's really low resolution, and so you get a lot of it, but it's not real knowledge. It's like, there was a funny New Yorker cartoon where a wife asked her husband, "Do you know that, or do you just Google know it?"
Right,
Which
exactly.
is right, and so and the thing about those shallow media interactions is that you also don't have to take any responsibility for them. Especially if you're anonymous, and that also brings out the worst in people. And the trolling phenomena. I mean, one of the things you notice about children, for example, is if children don't get enough good attention, they'll certainly go after bad attention, because the fundamental human currency is attention. And it's one thing to be hated, but it's another thing entirely to be ignored. And I would say, generally speaking, if you put people in a corner and you made them choose, if they had knowledge that was transparent to themselves, you said, well, would you rather be ignored or hated? They'd take hated, because at least then you exist, because you exist, at least in some part, in your relationship to other people. And so some of the bad behavior is rewarded precisely for that reason, is that it does draw attention, and that does make you signify. I mean, you think about the people who do heinous crimes, like the school shooters, people like that, who do these things that are almost inconceivable. A huge part of the drive for that is fantasies about notoriety and the emergence from obscurity and anonymity. Even though it's notorious, it's hatred, the idea is, I'd rather be dead and infamous than alive and anonymous.
Yeah, which, by the way, you, I think, were one of the first websites to say, we're not going to publish these people's names, because then we're giving them exactly what they want.
Yeah, exactly. Like there have been, I don't want to take credit as like the first, because there are several, their names escape me, but there are other people who have been promoting this for a while. But yeah, I was late to it. We should have done it earlier.
And I talked to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation about that about 10 years ago, about the idea that publicizing the names of these killers is precisely one of the mechanisms that ensures that it will continue to happen, and there's no doubt about that. Now, how to mitigate against that is very complicated.
Well, I mean, and that does tie to a deeper conversation. Did you see this study that was from the CDC that came out that, again, for the second straight year, life expectancy in the United States dropped? So you had consistent life expectancy increases in the United States for 150 years, and now, for the first time in modern American history, life expectancy has now dropped for 2 years in a row. And that's specifically due to two phenomena. One is the increase in heroin overdoses, and the other is suicide. Suicide is now at record rates in the modern era, and we had 70,000 heroin overdoses, opiate overdoses last year. I think it was 50,000 the year before. And so you're starting to see life expectancy decline. There's a crisis of meaning. And that's why, and I think that part of the resistance to, particularly I think Jordan, but I think also to me and to anyone else in the IDW who's at least searching for meaning, is that the left has been saying for a long time that we found the meaning, right? The meaning was do what you want to do. The meaning was no responsibility, do what you want to do. That's the meaning. The meaning is rebelling against the system. And when it turns out that a lot of people don't find meaning in that there is, in my perspective, a God-shaped hole in people's heart that is being filled by hatred and polarization and tribalism.
Or that you just can't do it forever. No one can maintain that level forever of trying to tear everything down all the time.
Well, it's also,
right?
there's nothing in it, especially as your opponent weakens. You know, this is, we thought maybe we'd talk a little bit about hierarchies. So, the thing about, one of the things a hierarchy does is fundamentally is put some things above other things. And you think, well, the left criticism of that, which is a valid criticism, is that if you erect a hierarchy, well, let me step one step back. We'll walk through this in a bit of a sequence. Okay, so the first proposition would be, we do have real problems, because people suffer, and we have real problems, and we would also like to solve them. and that solutions do exist. And that if you have a solution and then you implement it socially, and so you have to get people to cooperate and compete around the solution, you're going to produce a hierarchy. And if the hierarchy is valid, then the people who are the best at producing the solution to the problem are going to lead the hierarchy. Okay, so that would be a conservative right-wing position. It's like, we need hierarchies, they privilege values, and they're necessary to solve problems, and there is a relationship between the ability to solve the problem and the structure of the hierarchy. Okay, so when we'd say that's true when hierarchies are functioning well. Okay, so that's the right-wing viewpoint. And then the left-wingers would say, wait a second, your hierarchy gets rigid over time and ossifies and can be occupied by people who use power instead of competence to dominate it, and they do that unfairly, and they warp the structure of the hierarchy, and that makes it difficult for people to gain entry, including talented people. And then the hierarchy itself as a structure has a problem because dispossessed people tend to stack up at the bottom. And that all seems relevant and true, right? So then you could say, well, you need the right because you need the hierarchies, and they need to be implemented. And that's what managers and administrators do. That's what conscientious people do because they're hierarchically oriented. And it's a very efficient way of operating. And people are actually happier within hierarchies because there's an identifiable chain of command. But then the left has its position, which is, yeah, but you got to watch out for the dispossessed because they're the majority. And you have to make sure the thing doesn't degenerate towards tyranny. So then I think the political discussion is the left and the right constantly eyeing each other to make sure that the hierarchical structures maintain their good health. And that's why freedom of speech is necessary. Okay, so the issue with that, let's see if I can get back to where I was going with this to begin with. Oh yes, the issue with that is that if you're just a rebel, you say, well, we're going to criticize the system, whatever that is, so that's a very vague thing to begin with. You demolish that value hierarchy and the idea of value hierarchies as such, but then that puts you in a terrible conundrum. And this is what I've been focusing on in my public lectures, is that if you accept the essential idea that life is suffering, and life is suffering tainted by malevolence, which I think is an even more accurate formulation, you have a fundamental existential problem, and that's the suffering. And then you need a meaning to set against that to fortify you against the catastrophe. So, and if you demolish the hierarchies, then you have no meaning. There's nothing to strive for. And without that meaning, you're anxious and overwhelmed. By definition, we know that neuropsychologically because purpose boxes you in, right? It gives you a game to play and rules to follow. And then purpose gives you something to aim at in positive emotion. And so the problem with what the left is offering, and I think this is actually the kind of problem that Sam Harris and the atheist types are running into too, is that it's like, well, okay, where's the purpose? Well, we don't have one. It's just rebellion against the unfair hierarchy. It's like, yeah, but the hierarchy also provides you with value. Well, that's okay. Its cost is so high, we're going to demolish the hierarchy. Well, then you're left with nothing. Well, but no, you're not left with nothing because what you're left with is an inalienable suffering, not nothing. That's the suicide.
And I think that the left's solution to that has been intersectionality, meaning what they've done is they've just taken the hierarchy and they've said, the hierarchy is bad because it's ossified and it's terrible. And it's not just that they've destroyed the hierarchy and then we are all leveled. It's that they've inverted the hierarchy in certain ways. That merit itself has become a sign that you are an exploiter.
Yes.
Right? That if you're on the top of the hierarchy, then it's because you did something wrong to get there and you hurt someone to get there. And therefore, the last shall be first. We're going to just take this triangle and we're going to flip it upside down. So that way, the people who are at the bottom are at the top.
So I think there's something absolutely fundamental there too, because I've been trying to understand what the core issue is that drives the pathological left. And I think it is the story of Cain and Abel, fundamentally, is that it's jealousy of the successful. And the worst kind of successful person, as it turns out, from a jealousy perspective, speaking psychologically, is like if you got your power arbitrarily, if you inherited it or you got it unfairly, well, you're kind of annoying, but you're not that annoying because you're not that good. You're just lucky. And so I can be jealous of you because you're lucky, and that's unfair, but you're just as reprehensible as me.
Right.
But then let's take the alternative position. Let's say that I'm not taking responsibility for my life in any sense, and I'm not bearing any moral load. And it turns out that not only are you successful, but you're competent and good. Well, then you're a real enemy because you're a judge under those circumstances, right? Because it's your goodness, in some sense, your competence and your goodness that's really showing me in a negative light. And instead of wanting to contend with that and to see myself reflected badly in your mirror, then I'm going to make the accusation that everything you've done is merely a consequence of power. And even more deeply, I'm going to criticize the idea of merit and competence itself, because that gets me out of my self-loathing. Say, well, there's none of that's real. None of that merit, none of that competence is real. And none of the failure that I'm experiencing is a consequence of my own inaction. It's all someone, and then it's all someone else's fault. And then I get to be justified in going after them as well. So that's the icing on the cake.
And the Cain and Abel story is, I mean, it's explicit about this. I mean, this isn't even buried in the text, right? That's explicit. I mean, God specifically says to Cain, Tim Shell, right? You have the capacity to overcome, right? And Cain ignores it, and then he goes and kills Abel. And that's the whole idea.
That's the crux of that story, is that because Cain complains to God, says what he basically says something along the lines
of, life's not fair. What happened?
That's right. How dare you set up a universe like this, where I'm breaking myself in half, attempting to, to thrive, and everything's going against me, and I have my brother who everything that he touches turns to gold. And that's right. God says to him directly, look to yourself. It's your inadequacy that's driving this, and it's the last thing that Cain wants to hear. And that's what makes him murderous.
And I think that is the last thing that most people want to hear. That's what's so attractive about a leftist ideology that doesn't actually provide any sense of meaning outside of the victimhood cult. So this feeling that the last thing that people want to hear generally is look to yourself first. It's a lot easier to, I mean, but it's also so bad parenting, right?
But it's also funny because one of the things that's happening in my lectures is because I've been doing something different. Instead of saying, see, I think one of the things that the conservative types do wrong with regards to responsibility is that they conceptualize it too rigidly in terms of duty and should. And that's true, but it's also a mistake, because what I've been suggesting to people is that, no, you don't understand, is that all the meaning in your life is going to come as a consequence of accepting responsibility. It's not merely a matter of duty. It's that you need this sustaining meaning, because otherwise you suffer stupidly, and you get bitter, and you get resentful, and you get cruel, and you get homicidal, and you get genocidal. That's the whole pathway. And so that's a catastrophe. That's hell. And so if you don't have something meaningful to pursue, to set against that, that's the degeneration of nihilism. Okay, so where do you find the response? Where do you find the meaning? Say, well, you look at people that you admire, and almost all the people you admire are people who take on a heavy burden of responsibility. And if the responsibility is associated with the value hierarchy, so you're trying to pursue something of ultimate value, so that's the responsibility, that gives you meaning. And so you can talk to people about taking responsibility for their inadequacy if you point out to them that who they could be is much better than who they are, so that there's a trajectory, and so that the idea of taking on responsibility even for their own inadequacies and errors is all of a sudden associated with hope and not with only condemnation. And that works. And that, like, when I lay out that line of argument in the lectures, and Dave's seen this multiple times, it's always the case that the lecture halls go silent. So people are absolutely riveted on that idea.
And it was interesting. I did an interview with Tucker Carlson, who I know is in here with you also. And one of the things that we talked about was, what people should do in dying towns. They're in areas where the industry has left. What should they do? They're experiencing difficulty. And I was saying that telling people that the jobs are coming back falsely is not going to actually do anything for them. That the only thing that you're guaranteed in America or in a free country is the adventure, right? That's what you're guaranteed. And that's also what makes life meaningful, is that sense of adventure. That's what America was built on, right? That's the fundamental command, the very first command that Abraham has ever given, is get up, leave the land of your fathers where you're comfortable, and go someplace where I'm not even going to tell you where you're going. You're just going to go there, and then when you get there, maybe you'll know, right? But I think that one of the areas, Jordan, where you and I think it would be interesting to drill down, is when it comes to directing toward the purpose. How do we define what the purpose is? Because I think one of the things that's been difficult in the West, at least since the death of the Judeo-Christian value system in many ways, or at least the sort of, we're running on the fumes of the Judeo-Christian value system is the truth. But since the decline of the importance in many people's minds of that value system, the decline of biblical living, has been this idea you can create your own meaning. Right? You just, that if you find something that you truly care about, and then you pursue that thing that you truly care about, this will bring you happiness. And that may be true for a certain number of people, but the vast majority of people are incredibly crappy at coming up with their own meanings.
Yeah.
There has to be something that is out there that is discoverable in order for it to be discovered.
I think that's what the psychoanalysts, that's why I like Jung so much, because that's what made him such an astute critic of Nietzsche. Because Nietzsche believed we had to create our own values. But the psychoanalysts, starting with Freud, started to note that the values were actually built in. And Freud saw that, first of all, in dreams. Right, and then Jung took that apart and associated the dreams with the myths and said, no, you don't understand, is that the values are built in. You don't create them, you can rediscover them. And that's the resurrection of the father from the belly of the beast.
This does raise a question as to, and you and I have discussed this before, is where exactly that moral system comes from. So Kant obviously talks about the idea that he believes in God because of the starry sky above and the moral law within.
Yeah,
you can discover all this within. I am not convinced that human beings can actually discover meaning within, because if that were true, then the prosperity and liberalism and human rights and value for individuals and all the things that we associate with the good stuff in the West, that would have been universal. And it is not, in fact, universal. It arose at a certain time in a particular place associated with a particular value system. This is why when people ask me about why I think that revelation is necessary, why it's important, it's because I think that without you're going to have to make these fundamental assumptions. To get from point A to point B, you're going to have to make fundamental assumptions at point A. Now, you can either get that from revelation, or you can just assume it, and then try to explain where those assumptions came from, or you can just pretend those assumptions don't exist, which is, I think, actually what Sam sort of does. And I hate to criticize Sam in his absence, but I think that Sam sort of just assumes that when he says things like, we're here for the greater flourishing of human beings, you actually have to define every one of those terms. There are a bunch of assumptions baked into what all of that means that he's making, and I'm not sure that Sam will acknowledge he's making them. But that's why, to me, and this is sort of thesis of my book next year, the West is built on the basic revelations of Jerusalem, meaning human beings are made in God's image with individual value and with individual purpose, and with a collective purpose where we get together and we pursue living in a more virtuous way. And that's one pole. And the other pole is the reason of Greece, where we have the capacity to look at the world around us and draw conclusions from that world. And on those poles are built all of modern science, are built all of economics, are built the free speech and free lives that we live right now. And I think that we have been gradually, over the last 200 years, chipping away at both of those poles, Jerusalem in terms of revelation and Athens in terms of reason, which we've abandoned for postmodernism, and that's just deprived us of purpose.
So in a weird way, is this the failure of the Enlightenment liberals? All the people that I grew up loving and caring about, and the people that I still admire, and this little sliver of liberals that still remain, that haven't bought into leftist dogma, but that aren't necessarily religious per se or believe in these stories, but really they believe it comes from the Enlightenment period.
I think I think that's a good observation.
So that this is sort of their failure. I don't want to. I'm not blaming.
It's their arrogance, I would say, because even people
because there's not enough in the secular world to fight this new religion.
No,
that's where I'm sort of finding myself right now, which is an incredibly uncomfortable place. I come from a much more atheist perspective, obviously, than you, and certainly where you are. And yet I can see what the future is now. And it's like, there's nothing left over there. And we do need some fundamental truths. That's just the position that I've been cornered into.
You can't have the Enlightenment without the mythos underneath it.
Exactly.
You see,
so this is where you and Sam disagree,
and also
right?
with where I disagree with people like Steven Pinker.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm an Enlightenment guy, but the thing is that when I look backwards in time, you know, what people like Harris and Pinker attribute to the Enlightenment, I see as the Enlightenment being the latest flowering of a process that was indescribably older than that.
This is exactly right.
And in the historical sense, certainly grounded in the religious traditions, and then from my perspective, grounded in something that's biological, that's far deeper than that, like our true proclivity towards admiration for competence and reciprocity. And I do think that has to be socialized, back to your point. So one of the things Dave mentioned before we started this was that we could have a bit of a conversation about the difference between Judaism and Christianity in terms of...
I'd love to get to that. I do want to make one comment on the Neo-Enlightenment stuff. So, I mean, I will say that there is a full chapter in my book that is specifically about the views of a lot of people who I love, you know, Sam and Michael Shermer and Pinker and the whole Neo-Enlightenment strain of thought that I think kind of includes Jonah Goldberg on the conservative side.
Yeah. And I love these guys, and I feel, intellectually, I feel more comfortable with that position, but I realize I'm just being whittled away. I just see it can't hold much longer.
So here's my basic view and my basic thesis, is that there are two views of the Enlightenment. One is that, in Jonah Goldberg's words, it was the miracle, that it kind of sprang from nowhere. Suddenly reason dominated over revelation, and it crushed revelation, and in the wake of that crushing came the full flowering of economics and humanity and freedom and liberalism.
And that those things were opposed, reason and revelation were opposed.
Exactly. These were, and not only that they weren't in tension, they were fulsomely opposed. Because there is truth that reason and revelation are in tension, but it is also true that certain assumptions undergird the assumptions of reason. In order for you to believe that reason exists and isn't just an evolutionarily favorable firing of neurons, then you have to, I think that Sam's position that objective truth exists in the absence of anything remotely approaching a system of assumptions is unsupportable. It's completely unsupportable. I think that because you are built to create more little copies of you, right? I mean, this is evolutionarily speaking what you are created to do. How that has to do with discovering objective truth is utterly beyond me. And what it has to do with the existence of objective truth. In any case, the Enlightenment is based on certain fundamental assumptions. It's based on the idea that you can act as an individual freely by making rational decisions in a predictable world of laws, right? Every one of those assumptions is ungrounded in a world of pure scientific determinism. It just doesn't exist. So the Enlightenment actually ate itself. The Enlightenment ate itself. What happened is that the Enlightenment was, and I think that you see this in Kant, Kant sees all of this. He sees that this struggle is coming, and so he attempts to re-inject religion and spirituality and God back into a moral system without actually saying so, right? Kant is not actually an atheist. Kant is actually trying to create a rational basis for Christian revelation and Christian reasoning so that he can avoid the trap of having to cite the Bible, but he can say that all of this makes sense anyway.